Blood is thicker than water, but greed is thicker than both. For 32 years, I thought I was simply the independent daughter. I never knew that independence made me the perfect target. They smiled over expensive wine, demanding $50,000 for a fairy tale wedding. When I refused, they unleashed a legal nightmare to ruin my life. But if you back a cornered animal against a wall, you had better be prepared for its teeth. Hello and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization, leaving us without a budget to maintain operations. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon. There, you can listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories that we cannot publish publicly on YouTube, featuring multiple emotional voice actors bringing each narrative to life. You can join by simply scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story, experienced and told by Priscilla Bowers. The air inside the Prime Cut Steakhouse in downtown Chicago was thick with the scent of seared ribeye and expensive Cabernet. It was the kind of establishment where the lighting was deliberately dim, masking the true cost of the evening until the leather-bound check arrived. I sat across from my parents and my younger sister, Chloe, silently swirling the dark red liquid in my crystal glass. I was 32 years old, completely financially independent, and deeply suspicious of this sudden invitation. My family never did anything without a hidden agenda, and calling for an urgent, mandatory dinner on a Tuesday night was entirely out of character unless they wanted something. Chloe sat next to my mother, adjusting her designer dress and checking her reflection in her phone screen every 2 minutes. My parents wore their usual masks of refined affluence. We ordered. We made shallow small talk about the weather and my demanding job as an architect. Then, right before the main courses were served, the heavy velvet curtain of pleasantries dropped. My mother reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp, heavy stock piece of paper. She did not hand it to me. Instead, she placed it face up on the pristine white tablecloth and slid it across the table with the tip of her manicured index finger. I looked down. It was an itemized estimate from a luxury wedding planner. The total at the bottom was staggering. "Chloe is getting married next spring," my mother announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We are putting together the funds for the venue and the floral arrangements. We have decided that your contribution to your sister's special day will be $50,000. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I looked from the piece of paper to my mother, then to my father, who was calmly sipping his wine as if they had just asked me to pass the salt. Chloe looked at me with an expectant, entitled smile, fully believing that I would simply nod and write a check. $50,000. That was the exact amount I had painstakingly saved over the last 5 years, sacrificing vacations and living frugally to build a safety net for my own future. They knew exactly how much I had. They always had a way of prying into my life. I pushed the paper back across the table. I did not raise my voice, nor did I let any emotion bleed into my words. "No," I said evenly, "I am not paying for this." Chloe's smile vanished instantly. "What do you mean?" "No, it is my wedding." "I mean exactly what I said," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on my mother. "My savings are to secure my own future, not to fund a flashy, extravagant party for someone else. I am perfectly happy to buy you a nice blender from your registry, Chloe, but I am not giving you $50,000. I braced myself for the usual theatrical explosion. I expected my mother to cry, or my sister to storm out of the restaurant in a dramatic fit. I expected the loud, guilt-inducing arguments that had defined my childhood, but the explosion never came. Instead, the atmosphere at the table turned terrifyingly cold. The silence was heavy, suffocating, and far more menacing than any screaming match could ever be. My mother slowly folded the estimate and put it back into her bag. My father finally set his wine glass down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and stared at me with eyes so devoid of warmth they looked like polished stones. "You will regret making us take this step," my father said. His voice was low, sharp, and completely devoid of paternal affection. It was the tone of a ruthless businessman negotiating a hostile takeover. I left the restaurant shortly after, my stomach tied in knots. I tried to convince myself it was just an empty threat, a pathetic attempt to manipulate me through fear. I went to sleep that night telling myself that they would eventually give up and find someone else to exploit. I was entirely wrong. The next morning, the sky over Chicago was a bleak, slate gray. I was in my kitchen at 7 o'clock, pouring my first cup of coffee and preparing for a long day at the architecture firm. I had just taken my first sip when a series of thunderous knocks rattled my front door. The impacts were so violent that the decorative frosted glass panes in the wooden frame physically shook. I tightened the belt of my robe and walked to the entryway. Peering through the peephole, my heart skipped a beat. Standing on my porch were 4 men in sharp, custom-tailored black suits. They did not look like delivery drivers. They did not look like police officers. They looked exactly like what they were. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The freezing morning wind swept into my foyer. The man at the front, holding a massive, densely packed manila folder, looked at me with cold, professional detachment. "Are you the homeowner?" he asked, verifying my identity without speaking my name. "Yes," I answered, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to remain calm. He shoved the heavy folder into my hands. "Consider yourself formally served." I stood frozen on my porch as the 4 corporate lawyers turned on their heels and marched back to their sleek black town car parked at the curb. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents in my hands. I tore open the seal and pulled out the first page. I expected to see a ridiculous lawsuit about emotional distress, or a formal letter disowning me from the family. But that is not what it was. It was a formal legal warning demanding the immediate enforcement of a massive financial contract, a contract that I supposedly signed, a contract that I had absolutely no memory of ever seeing in my entire life. The trap had not just been set. Its iron jaws had already snapped shut around my ankle. The commute to Novus Peak Architecture felt like navigating through a thick, suffocating fog. I clutched my leather tote bag so tightly my knuckles turned white, acutely aware of the dense manila folder burning a hole against my side, walking through the sweeping glass doors of the firm. I forced my spine straight and plastered on the same polished, professional smile I wore for high-profile client pitches. I nodded at the receptionist, exchanged brief pleasantries with a senior partner by the elevator, and practically sprinted down the hallway the moment I was out of their sight. Once inside my private office, I slammed the heavy oak door shut and threw the deadbolt. The metallic click of the lock echoing in the quiet room was the only thing holding my fragile composure together. My hands shook violently as I dumped the contents of the folder onto my expansive drafting table. I had expected to find petty demands for wedding contributions, perhaps some absurd legal maneuvering to force me to pay for the floral arrangements or the luxury venue they wanted. I read the first page, then the second, then the third. There was absolutely no mention of a wedding, a bridal registry, or catering fees. Instead, the stark, black and white text outlined a catastrophic financial nightmare. The documents were a formal notice of default regarding a massive commercial debt tied to a supposed family trust fund. The numbers printed across the pages made my vision blur. We were not talking about $50,000 anymore. The figures were astronomically higher, and they were all dragging my name down into a bottomless pit of liability. My breath hitched in my throat as I frantically scanned the dense paragraphs of legal jargon, desperately searching for a mistake, a typo, anything to prove this was a massive misunderstanding. My chest tightened until I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of the paper. I needed someone who could see through the panic. I grabbed my phone and dialed the only person I trusted unconditionally. Julian answered on the second ring. He was my fiancé, a senior cybersecurity analyst whose entire career revolved around dissecting complex threats and remaining deadpan in the face of digital chaos. His voice was a steady, grounding anchor pulling me back from the edge of a panic attack. "I need you," I whispered, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to control it. Something is horribly wrong. My parents sent lawyers to my house this morning. It is not about the wedding. I need you to look at these papers. I will be at your office at noon, Julian replied instantly, asking no unnecessary questions. Breathe. We will handle it together. The hours until our lunch break were pure agony. I stared blankly at my computer monitor, completely unable to focus on my architectural designs. When Julian finally walked into my office, he locked the door behind him and immediately took off his suit jacket, rolling up his sleeves. I had pushed the sprawling blueprints of a downtown skyscraper aside to make room for the legal documents. He pulled up a chair and began to read, his eyes darting across the pages with analytical precision. For 20 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the crisp rustling of paper. Finally, Julian leaned back, tapped a pen against his chin, and pointed to the letterhead of the law firm on the very first page. "Do you know who these people are?" he asked, his tone devoid of any alarm but laced with a sharp, calculating intensity. "Lawyers," I replied, feeling completely numb. "My parents hired them to intimidate me." Julian shook his head slowly. "These are not family law attorneys handling domestic disputes or estate squabbles. This firm is notorious in the financial sector. They are corporate sharks. Their entire business model is high-stakes commercial debt recovery and aggressive asset liquidation. You do not hire these guys on a whim because you had a fight at a steakhouse on a Tuesday night." I stared at him, the horrifying implications slowly seeping into my brain. "Think about the timeline," Julian continued, leaning forward and tapping the date stamped on the notice. "Firms like this require massive retainers and weeks, if not months, of preliminary asset investigation before they even draft a warning like this. They do not just show up at your door at 7 in the morning because your parents called them angry last night." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The dinner was never about asking for wedding money, the anger, the cold stares, the theatrical threat. It was all a staged performance. The psychological intimidation campaign had been planned, funded, and set into motion months in advance. They had invited me to that dinner knowing full well that these corporate sharks were already scheduled to ambush me at dawn. For a brief, fleeting moment, a profound wave of grief washed over me. The last remaining illusion of my family shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but a jagged, ugly truth. My own flesh and blood had meticulously orchestrated a plan to destroy my life. But as quickly as the grief arrived, it evaporated. The urge to break down, to cry, to curl up in a ball and ask why they would do this to me. All of that weakness simply burned away. It was replaced by a sudden, glacial calmness. A cold, calculating fury settled deep in my bones, hardening my resolve. I looked at the legal papers scattered across my desk, then looked directly into Julian's eyes. I was done being the independent daughter they thought they could easily exploit. I was going to tear their entire operation apart, piece by piece. The living room of my apartment transformed into a high-stakes digital war room the moment the sun went down. Julian had immediately driven to his own place to retrieve his heavy-duty workstation laptops, setting them up across my dining table in a chaotic but highly purposeful array of glowing screens, tangled cables, and encrypted hard drives. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense, heavy with the sterile, analytical focus of a financial true crime investigation. We were no longer dealing with toxic, manipulative family dynamics. We were actively dissecting a calculated corporate conspiracy. I paced the hardwood floor continuously, watching the rapid reflection of scrolling code and complex database interfaces flashing across Julian's glasses. Utilizing his extensive cybersecurity expertise, he completely bypassed the superficial search engine results and dove straight into the deep, murky waters of public financial records, state corporate registries, and commercial property liens tied to my parents' names. He was a digital bloodhound, meticulously tracking the invisible trails of money that my family thought they had so cleverly hidden behind layers of bureaucracy. "I am looking at their recent tax filings and the Uniform Commercial Code records right now," Julian muttered, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with rhythmic, uninterrupted intensity. There is a massive, convoluted web of limited liability companies here, all designed to funnel capital into one central entity. It is officially registered under Chloe's name. I stopped pacing and stood directly behind his chair, staring at the cascading lines of raw data on the monitor. Chloe does not have a real business. She just posts pictures of expensive designer clothes online and calls herself an influencer. That is where you are wrong, Julian replied, pulling up a highly redacted financial summary from a state government database. She legally registered a luxury fashion brand exactly 3 years ago. From the looks of these profit and loss margins, it is a complete vanity project. There is absolutely no sustainable revenue, just catastrophic overhead costs for marketing and inventory that never sells. She has been bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate. The business is not just failing, it is actively sinking into a financial abyss and dragging everything down with it. The first major piece of the puzzle violently clicked into place in my mind. The extravagant spring wedding my mother had spoken of with such artificial sweetness was nothing but a meticulously crafted smokescreen. There was no fiancé, there was no luxury venue, there were no floral arrangements. It was a desperate cover story designed to extract capital from me without raising any suspicion about their impending bankruptcy. "Keep digging," I urged, my voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper. "How are my parents financially connected to her failing company?" Julian rapidly switched between 3 different monitors, cross-referencing the corporate registration documents with my parents' real estate property records. Here is the direct linkage to keep Chloe's sinking ship afloat. Your parents did not just give her their personal savings, they systematically leveraged every single tangible asset they possessed. They took out a massive commercial loan against their own property to inject emergency capital into her brand. But it was not enough. The business continued to hemorrhage money, and now, that commercial loan is severely past due. He highlighted a specific, dense paragraph in a bank notice that he had managed to retrieve from an unsecured county clerk server. Look at this default notice. The commercial lender initiated the preliminary stages of foreclosure precisely 2 weeks ago. However, there is a standard grace period clause. If the debtor pays a specific, immediate penalty fee, it halts the asset seizure process entirely and buys them exactly 30 days to restructure the massive debt. I leaned closer to the bright monitor, my eyes scanning the legal text until I found the exact monetary figure required for the immediate penalty. The breath caught painfully in my throat. The required penalty fee was exactly $50,000. The bizarre dinner at the Prime Cut Steakhouse had never been about a wedding contribution. It was a targeted, desperate shakedown. They needed exactly $50,000 in liquid cash to throw at the bank to stop the immediate confiscation of their home and their remaining assets. When I calmly refused to hand over my life savings, I had inadvertently signed their financial death warrant. But the true horror was still waiting in the dark. Julian suddenly went completely rigid. The rapid clacking of his keyboard stopped instantly, replaced by a deafening, heavy silence that filled the entire apartment. He stared intensely at the center monitor, his jaw tight, his eyes wide with a mixture of professional shock and deep, protective anger. "What is it?" I asked, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "Julian, what did you just find?" He did not say a single word. He simply clicked his mouse and dragged a digital document from his secondary screen to the main monitor so I could see it clearly. It was a high-resolution scan of the original commercial loan agreement. My eyes darted to the top of the page, where the total principal amount of the loan was printed in bold, undeniable ink. It was $500,000, $500,000. Then, I looked down at the section detailing the terms of liability. My vision tunneled. The room seemed to spin violently around me. There, under the section explicitly designated for the primary guarantor, was my full legal name, alongside my highly confidential Social Security number, my current residential address, and my exact date of birth. The ruthless corporate sharks who had ambushed me at dawn were not trying to sue me for wedding funds. They were moving to execute a full-scale financial slaughter. because my name was fraudulently listed as the primary guarantor on a defaulted $500,000 commercial loan. The law firm was legally authorized to freeze all of my bank accounts, put a heavy lien on my personal property, and aggressively garnish my professional wages until the entire $500,000 debt was satisfied. They were going to strip me of everything I had ever worked for to pay for my family's rotten, failed enterprise. I gripped the back of Julian's leather chair so tightly, my nails dug into the material. The truth was no longer just a heartbreaking familial betrayal. It was a severe, premeditated federal crime. My parents had stolen my identity. They had taken my personal information, fabricated official documents, and forged my signature on a $500,000 contract, serving me up as the ultimate sacrificial lamb to save themselves. The independent daughter was never just a target for petty cash. I was their meticulously planned escape route. The silence in my apartment had become heavy, charged with the dangerous electricity of a battlefield just before the first shot is fired. We had spent the next 48 hours meticulously cataloging every piece of evidence Julian had unearthed. The initial shock had completely worn off, leaving behind a sterile, hyper-focused clarity. I was no longer a grieving daughter reeling from an emotional betrayal. I was an architect drafting the structural collapse of my enemies, calculating load-bearing walls and preparing to remove them all at once. On Thursday afternoon, my cell phone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. Julian immediately stopped typing, his eyes meeting mine. I took a deep breath, centered myself, and answered the call, pressing the speakerphone button so her voice echoed in the quiet room. "Priscilla, darling," my mother began. Her voice was shockingly soft, coated in a thick, suffocating layer of maternal concern. It was a masterful performance, completely devoid of the icy menace she had wielded at the steakhouse. "I am so heartbroken over this entire situation. Your father and I have barely slept. This legal mess has simply gotten entirely out of hand, and it is tearing our family apart." I remained silent, leaning against the kitchen counter, letting her weave her intricate web of manipulation. "We do not want to see you suffer," she continued, her tone dripping with manufactured empathy. "Your father spoke with the law firm this morning. We pleaded with them. We managed to negotiate a private settlement. If you can just transfer $20,000 to cover the immediate administrative fees, we can protect our family bond and chase those awful lawyers away for good. We will handle the rest. Sweetie, we just need this small compromise so everyone can move on and heal." $20,000. They had realized they could not extort the full $50,000 from me directly, so they were pivoting, trying to grab whatever liquid cash they could to delay the bank foreclosure before the entire facade crumbled. Before I could utter a single word in response, Julian rapidly slashed his hand across his throat in a silencing gesture. He grabbed a yellow legal pad, scribbled a frantic message in heavy black ink, and shoved it directly into my line of sight. The note read, "Illinois State Law. Do not agree to anything." Julian muted the microphone on my phone with a swift tap. He leaned in close, his voice a harsh, urgent whisper. "It is a legal trap, under Illinois Civil Code. If you pay even 1 single cent toward a disputed debt, the court automatically views that payment as a formal acknowledgement of the entire obligation. If you give her that $20,000, you are legally validating the forged contract. You will be instantly on the hook for the entire $500,000, and those corporate lawyers will drain your bank accounts and garnish everything you own. Do not give them a dime." The sheer malice of her strategy took my breath away. She was not offering a compromise. She was handing me a loaded gun and softly asking me to pull the trigger on my own financial independence. I nodded at Julian, my expression hardening into stone. I unmuted the phone. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, injecting a perfectly calibrated amount of fear and exhaustion into my voice. "Okay," I whispered, letting my voice crack slightly. "Okay, Mom. You win. I am so tired of fighting. I cannot handle these lawyers coming to my house again. It is ruining my career. I will pay the $20,000. I could practically hear the triumphant smile spreading across her face through the receiver. "Oh, Priscilla, I knew you would understand. Blood is always thicker than water. Just wire the money to my account this afternoon, and I will take care of the rest." "No," I interjected quickly, maintaining the facade of a terrified, desperate victim who had finally been broken. "I will give you the money, but I refuse to do this informally. If I am giving up my savings, I want absolute legal protection. I want to sign the settlement papers in person, in front of the actual attorneys. I want everything to be crystal clear on paper so they can never come after me again. Set up a formal meeting at the corporate law firm's boardroom." There was a brief, hesitant pause on the line. Then, the blinding nature of their greed overpowered any lingering caution. "Of course, darling, if that makes you feel secure, we will arrange it for tomorrow morning." The moment the call ended, I did not waste a single second celebrating. I immediately contacted a highly specialized defense attorney named Marcus Thorne. Marcus was not a typical family lawyer who dealt with emotional mediation. He was a veteran bulldog who exclusively handled federal financial fraud and white-collar criminal defense. When I sat in his office later that evening and showed him Julian's digital evidence alongside the forged contract, Marcus did not blink. He simply smiled a slow, predatory smile and told me exactly how we were going to dismantle them. Everything was meticulously positioned. The board was set. By demanding the meeting take place inside the sterile, highly monitored environment of the corporate law firm, I was severely limiting my parents' ability to manipulate the narrative. There would be official records. There would be corporate witnesses. There would be nowhere to run. I had willingly painted myself as the perfect, terrified prey, deliberately luring the hunters straight into a reinforced glass cage. They thought they were about to execute a brilliant financial checkmate, completely unaware that the board had already been flipped. The meeting took place inside a sprawling, glass-enclosed boardroom located on the 50th floor of a high-rise building in downtown Chicago. The panoramic view of the bustling city skyline below was spectacular, but the air inside the room was sterile, heavy, and completely devoid of warmth. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors, my parents and Chloe were already seated on one side of a massive mahogany conference table. They looked like royalty waiting to collect a mandatory tax. My mother wore a pristine designer blazer, her legs elegantly crossed, offering me a tight, sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. Chloe barely looked up from her phone screen, a triumphant, mocking smirk playing on her lips. At the center sat my father, leaning back in his ergonomic leather chair with his hands resting casually on his stomach, exuding the smug confidence of a hunter watching an animal step willingly into a snare. Lining the opposite side of the table were the four corporate attorneys in their immaculate black suits. They operated with ruthless efficiency. The moment I sat down, the lead attorney, a broad-shouldered man with cold gray eyes, immediately slid a dense stack of settlement documents across the polished wood. He did not offer me a glass of water. He did not offer any pleasantries. Instead, he launched into a rapid-fire barrage of complex legal jargon, deliberately designed to overwhelm and disorient me. He weaponized terms like irrevocable liability, immediate indemnification, and binding arbitration, painting a terrifying picture of total financial ruin if I did not cooperate. He tapped a heavy gold pen against the signature line at the bottom of the final page, firmly instructing me to sign my name and hand over the cashier check for $20,000 right this exact second. Sitting directly in the center of the mahogany table, exactly equidistant between my family and me, was a digital audio recorder. Its small circular red light blinked steadily, recording every single breath and spoken word for the official mediation record. I stared at that blinking red light for a fraction of a second before beginning my performance. I let my shoulders slump forward, shrinking into my chair to make myself appear small and defeated. I forced my hands to tremble visibly as I reached out to touch the edge of the settlement papers. I sniffled, wiping a fabricated tear from the corner of my eye. "I just do not understand," I whispered, my voice wavering perfectly. I looked up at the lead attorney with wide, panicked eyes, playing the role of the hopelessly confused daughter to absolute perfection. I want to make this right. I brought the money like you asked, but my mind is completely blank. I am so overwhelmed with my architecture projects. I do not even remember when I signed a primary guarantee for this massive commercial fund. How did this happen? The lead attorney let out a quiet, condescending sigh, clearly viewing me as a weak, hysterical woman wasting his highly billable time. He offered a patronizing smile, preparing to explain it to me like a child. But before the lawyer could speak, my father leaned forward. His massive ego simply could not resist the opportunity to assert his dominance on the official record. He wanted to crush my final moment of hesitation and establish his complete control. He cleared his throat loudly, ensuring his voice carried directly into the microphone of the blinking recording device. "Stop playing the confused victim, Priscilla," my father declared, his voice booming with artificial authority. "You know perfectly well what you did. We went over the paperwork together. You sat right on the brown leather sofa in our living room and signed it yourself. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening on a Friday in October of last year. You came over after work. We had a family discussion, and you agreed to help your sister." To completely solidify my father's brazen lie, the lead attorney reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a separate document enclosed in a clear plastic sleeve. He tossed it onto the center of the table with a theatrical flick of his wrist. It was the final page of the original commercial loan contract. There, in bold black ink, was a flawless, masterful forgery of my signature. But they had not stopped at a simple signature. Stamped directly beside my forged name was the raised, official seal of a licensed notary public. I recognized the name on the stamp instantly. It belonged to an old country club friend of my father, a man who had clearly been bribed to validate a completely fraudulent document. They had laid out all their cards: the time, the date, the specific location, the forged signature, and the corrupt notary seal were all officially documented and permanently captured by the blinking red light of the digital audio recorder. The trap I had meticulously built was now fully armed, and they had just willingly locked the steel door from the inside. I stared at the forged document for 5 long seconds. Then, I took a deep, steadying breath. The trembling in my hands ceased entirely. I dropped my slumped posture. Pushing my shoulders back and sitting completely upright in the heavy leather chair, I reached up and wiped away the remaining traces of my fake tears. The naive, terrified expression I had worn since I walked into the room vanished without a single trace. I looked directly across the table into my father's eyes, and the temperature in the glass boardroom plummeted to absolute zero. I did not break eye contact with my father. I simply raised my right hand and tapped my index finger against the glass table twice. The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with a forceful thud. My attorney, Marcus Thorne, strode into the room. He did not wear a generic corporate suit. He wore a tailored navy pinstripe, projecting the terrifying aura of a man who spent his entire career dismantling financial predators in federal court. Marcus walked directly to my side and slammed a massive, leather-bound binder onto the center of the mahogany table. The loud smack echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "What is the meaning of this?" the lead corporate attorney demanded, his thick eyebrows knitting together in sudden confusion. "This is a private, legally binding mediation session." "Not anymore," Marcus replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute authority. "I am Marcus Thorne, lead counsel for Priscilla Bowers, and this mediation is officially over because you are attempting to extort my client using a blatantly forged financial instrument." My father scoffed loudly, attempting to maintain his facade of control. "That is a ridiculous accusation I just stated on the official record that she signed it right in front of me at our house." Marcus offered a shark-like grin and flipped the heavy binder open. He slid the first stack of high-definition photographs across the table. "That is a fascinating claim. You explicitly stated, on a recorded legal device, that your daughter was sitting on your living room sofa at exactly 8 o'clock on that specific Friday in October. That is quite unfortunate for you, because we possess absolute, irrefutable proof that she was exactly 30 miles away at that precise second. The lead attorney leaned forward, his gray eyes scanning the documents. My client is a senior architect at Novus Peak Architecture, Marcus continued, pacing slowly behind my chair. Her firm handles highly classified government contracts. On that exact Friday night, there was a catastrophic server failure. My client was locked inside the subterranean high-security server room handling the crisis. What you are looking at right now is a certified, time-stamped extraction of her biometric data. Marcus pointed a long finger at the glossy pages. We have the encrypted keycard swipe logs. We have the biometric retina scan registry, proving she accessed the vault at 7:30 that evening and did not exit until well past midnight. And just to ensure there is absolutely no margin for error, we have time-stamped, high-definition security camera footage showing her physical presence in that server room at exactly 8 o'clock. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The smug, triumphant sneer melted off my sister Chloe's face, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed mask of sheer terror. My mother clutched her designer handbag to her chest, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. My father stared at the biometric logs, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, completely unable to form a single coherent word. But the most dramatic transformation occurred across the table. The four ruthless corporate sharks realized exactly what had just happened. The blood drained from the lead attorney's face so fast, he looked like a corpse. He stared at the forged signature, then at the notary stamp, and finally at my parents. He realized they had manipulated his prestigious firm into presenting a forged document in an official capacity. "You lied to us," the lead attorney hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of pure rage and cold sweat. "You used our firm to facilitate a federal financial fraud. If we proceed with this collection, we are complicit in a major felony." He did not wait for my father to respond. The attorney violently shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against the polished floor. He hastily shoved his files into his briefcase, snapping the latches shut. "As of this exact second, our firm completely terminates all legal representation for you and your family." The lawyer barked at my parents. "Do not ever contact our offices again. If you try to drag us into this, we will testify against you." The four men practically sprinted out of the boardroom, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. My parents and my sister were left entirely alone, stripped of their legal shields, sitting in the devastating wreckage of their own hubris. I slowly stood up from my leather chair. I looked down at the people who shared my blood, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, sterile sense of finality. "You thought I was just an independent daughter you could exploit," I said, my voice completely steady and quiet. "You thought you could steal my identity, destroy my future, and walk away clean, but you miscalculated everything. That binder Marcus gave you is merely a courtesy copy." My father looked up at me, his hands shaking violently. "Priscilla, please, wait. We can fix this. We can figure out a way to pay the bank." "There is nothing left to fix," I replied gently. "I sent the original digital files, the video footage, the forged contract, and the corrupt notary seal directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 1 hour ago. Have a nice life." I turned my back on them and walked out of the glass doors, leaving them to suffocate in the cage they built for me. Exactly 1 year later, the dust had finally settled. Chloe's fake luxury brand went completely bankrupt, her assets liquidated to pay off a fraction of the massive debt. My parents lost their sprawling estate and are currently facing severe federal prison sentences for aggravated identity theft and bank fraud. The corrupt notary lost his license and is facing his own criminal charges. As for me, I stood on the sprawling balcony of the new penthouse apartment I purchased with Julian, watching the golden sunset wash over the Chicago skyline. I took a deep breath of the crisp, evening air. I finally understood that the sweetest, most absolute revenge was not just watching them fall. It was living a beautiful, completely free life, having permanently excised the toxic tumors that merely disguise themselves as family. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are all listening from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and want to support the channel, please consider joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon. There, you can listen to our absolute best, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can join easily by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by using the Patreon link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you again, and stay safe.